So today I want to talk about late period English heraldry and complexity, and the presentation's based off my statistical analysis of a particular armorial called Insignia Anglica. So it was created around 1550. I haven't seen anyone be clear about exactly when the date was, and to be honest, a work this long, it's got over 100 pages of colour painted arms, probably took quite a while. So the date that it was started and the date where it's finished was probably quite different anyway. It includes the arms of King Henry VIII and all of 6 of his wives. So that suggests that it was, and they're on one of the earliest pages. So that suggests it was between 1543 and 1547. However, William Paulet's arms included as with his titles of both the Count of Wiltshire and the Marquis of Winchester, which wasn't awarded to him until 1551. If you're interested in looking at any of this stuff, because it's got a lot of gorgeous Tudor heraldry, and in fact got a lot of early period stuff because a lot of the lords included have had their arms at this point for 400 or 500 years, and have marshaled them with a bunch of other things that they've collected along the way. So it's available in the Munich Library, the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, at that hyperlink. So, Tudor heraldry, it's well known for a significant increase in the complexity of arms, and that's often ascribed to the development of paper heraldry, since improvements to military technology meant that heraldry wasn't required to be clearly comprehensible on the battlefield. And Beatrice, as we were talking just before the start of this session, she suggested that I look at two arms that are done in the Tudor style recently in the SCA, registered in the SCA. So I've just grabbed them off Oscar in the last 5 minutes. But there you can see 2 there. And as we go through looking at the actual style, you'll be able to see just how well done these are. And they're both really excellent in terms of being very extreme, super complex Tudor style. And if we have time, maybe we'll come back at the end and just touch base on why this is such a good example of Tudor heraldry. All right. So the aims of my analysis of collating all the data was to assist SCA heralds to design devices, both simple and complex, in an authentic late period English style. Also to assist with individually attested pattern IAP documentation for complex designs that are consistent with Tudor style, and to determine where late period heraldic style is inconsistent with the core style rules. And so there's opportunities for other IAP documentation. So where if you've got a submitter who wants a particular thing, where you might be able to create something authentic that also, but where they want a particular thing that doesn't fit with the core style, but does fit within Tudor heraldry, you can work with the submitter to create something that's really authentic for Tudor style and registerable, and contains those elements that they might want. Just as a note, I'm going to use jargon from the rules like IAPs. Is anyone not an experienced armorial herald who is on? And if you are, just feel free to speak up, pop a note in the chat, or just speak up and say, Don, can you explain whatever jargon I've just used that didn't make sense? Alternately, I may just pronounce things differently because I'm down here in Stormhold. And if anything doesn't make sense because of my accent, feel free to stick your hand up and let me know as well. Okay. So the data I collected, Insignia Anglica, as I said, has over 100 pages. The early pages have very big achievements of arms, complete with supporters for the biggest nobles in England, and also some foreign sovereigns. And then later on, there are 12 devices per page for the majority of the armorial. So there's 1,027 achievements of arms in total. Many of them are marshalled with up to 13 quarters. So because this is SCA analysis, I've focused on the design of individual unmarshalled devices. So I've basically broken up those marshalled devices into individual device designs and treated each quarter as an individual device. So where a device has a repeated quarter, I've ignored that. So for example, I've got here the arms of the Viscount of Hereford. And so this one, quarters 1 and 4 are the same and quarters 2 and 3 are the same. So I've recorded quarters 1 and 2 and ignored 3 and 4 for the purposes of my analysis. So what that results in is an original database of 1,687 devices blazoned by me, with some help from the Facebook group a few years ago when I started this project, and a bit of help from the DBA as well, where I could find arms in this armorial that also were described in DBA, which wasn't always the case. Then for this analysis, I removed 348 duplicate devices, which were mostly devices marshalled by multiple families. So multiple families showing in their arms that they were related to this, original noble family. And also 15 arms of foreign monarchs, because we're looking at just English style. So that gave me a final database of 1,324 devices. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of my findings from the analysis. So I'm going to define high complexity for the purposes of my analysis. We're going to have a look at some examples of super complex heraldry, just some key points from the data analysis that I thought were interesting, and sort of work towards some suggestions for what you can do more to be authentic Tudor heraldry, a particularly complex Tudor heraldry, and also some things to do less. So here is a chart showing the distribution of complexity counts in Tudor heraldry. So I've blazoned all the devices, and then I've counted up the number of tinctures and the number of charge types, added them together, and that gives you the complexity count. So as most of you will know, 8 is the maximum allowed under Senna. And so you can see here that Tudor heraldry goes well above 8. I mean, a lot of these devices still in use in late period England are low complexity. They're 3, 4, and 5 are the most common. And that's a combination of older families using very simple heraldry, but also newer nobles choosing to use relatively simple heraldry as well. But the thing about Tudor heraldry is it blows 8 right out of the water. There's over 50 devices with 9 complexity, 30 odd at 10, and some at 11 and 12, and even one at 15, which we'll see in just a second. So for the purposes of this analysis, because what I wanted to do was just sort of, for this session, to compare what I call normal complexity English style with high complexity English style. So I've grouped 8 and above because I thought that was a good delineation between, so that's the very margin of legal under the standard rules, and past that rule. So that gave me 198 devices in the smaller high complexity group that I've called it. Okay. So what I've done next is I've just collected the 9 devices. So you can see under 12, there's 8 devices in that bar there, and then 1 device at complexity 15. And so I've collected them on the next few slides just so we can have a look at what's making them quite so complex. So once you get to that complexity, obviously you get some very long blazons. But here, points to note from these first 2 devices, I'm not sure what this family has to do with Milan or the Visconti family, but they're using the Bisione, the crowned serpent eating a child or eating a man, a Saracen, depending on which version of the Bisione you're using. You can see chiefs, you can see ordinaries with secondaries around them, and charged chiefs. So if we have a look at the next 2, again, we've got ordinaries and chiefs that are charged, And these two, we've got mixed secondaries, which is something you see in, not just in the very most complex devices, but fairly commonly in the complex devices in Tudor heraldry is mixed secondaries. It's never mixed primaries. You're not going to get slot machine in primary charge groups, but in secondary charge groups around an ordinary, there's plenty of examples of completely mixed secondaries. So in both these examples, there's 4 completely different charges in each quarter. Now note that the field remains plain. So it's the same field underneath each, which assists with it not looking as much like marshalling as it might otherwise, particularly that quarter, the one with a different charge in each quarter. There's also the ordinary and the chief sort of lending to the idea that this isn't marshalling, this is just someone wanted to include a lot of charges, a bit like an resume heraldry that you sometimes see in the SCA. So period people were not necessarily any more able to resist the urge to have resume heraldry than modern players. Again, we've got, and in this case, you can see a quaternary charge. So we've got a Talbot statant on a black, on a roundel sable on a chief ore. And we should see that some more in the later ones. So again here, 2 more devices, again with quaternary charges, again on roundels. And this time they're mixed. So you've got one, the 2 forms of mixed charges you will see is a middle charge surrounded by the same charge, or completely slot machine. And you might have noticed in this 2 slides before this one and this slide, the only use of vert we've seen throughout these very complex devices, the only use of any tincture other than the main 5 tinctures is in popinjays. So these are parrots who throughout the armorial, you can tell they're popinjays because they're vert with red beaks and red claws. So again, some more examples. We've got mixed charges. These times they're not quaternary, they're tertiary on the chief and on the secondary as well. We've got some pure here, which is the only example, well, one of the very few examples of pure in the entire armorial. And it's charged roundels again. And last but not least, we've got crescents charged with roundels, a roundel charge with a demi-lion. We've got some vert in the field. I think this might be the only field with vert in it in the entire armorial. And again, mixed secondaries on an ordinary. All right. Are there any questions before I start to dive into some statistics?
Do those crescents platy count as having an extra charge? Because that looks like it's just a tincture there.
Well, it could be, but they are plates. So under SCA rules, that would be a quaternary charge. And given there's so many other quaternary charges, I mean, it's unusual because it's 3. This might be the only example with it being a semi effectively, like as you say, a bit more like a tincture. Then all the other examples, I'm pretty sure it's a single charge on a charge.
That's what I had seen, yeah.
Yeah, that might be hard to get away with if you weren't. I mean, you might be able to get away with an IAP for this exact sort of thing, like a crescent charged with roundels. But it's probably not evidence of multiple quaternary charges, because I think that's probably pushing it.
IAP would still require 3 examples, and if this is the only example, it's not going to fly.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of examples of quaternary charges, so you could try your luck, and if you fought the battle well in Oscar, you know.
Which I do not have a history of doing.
It depends on the sovereign of arms. That's all I'm going to say. All right, let's get into some stats, unless there's any more questions. Nope. Okay. So the next few slides, I'm going to compare some statistics in different sorts of formats of how to build up, how Tudor heraldry is built up, and comparing sort of the base English style, which is all the devices in the armorial, including the high complexity ones, versus just the high complexity ones, and see where things are different and where things are the same. So in this first case, I've just looked at tinctures. So this is tinctures of the field and tinctures of charges. There wasn't a lot of difference between the use of tinctures as charges and as fields. I mean, there's some tinctures that lend themselves better to fields like ver, and some that are pretty much only used in charges like vert. But you can see here that the 5 main tinctures are the vast majority of tincture use in the heraldry. And the way I created this graph was I just counted every single tincture. So if a device had 5 tinctures in it, which a lot of these complex ones do, it counts for 5 counts in this pie chart. So it's unsurprising that argent and or are the most common, because obviously you need at least one of those for contrast. And then the 3 colors are next, followed by, you know, the less common tinctures like ermine and vert and ver and purpura and counter ermine. I've eliminated, there's a few tinctures that I didn't include because there were less than 5 total counts in the main graph, or less than 2 counts in the high complexity graph. So very gules and all is one of them. Brown is one that only features in the high complexity graph because there weren't enough proper brown things in the main group to include it in that chart. All right, so fields. What I'm trying to do with this chart is show that the vast majority of fields are plain. So what I did was I did a stacked bar chart as a percentage. And then I just sliced off the bottom 75% of it, which was just plain for all devices. And then you can see, once you get to complex devices, you actually see more use of plain fields. The complexity is not in the field. For the vast majority of highly complex devices, the field is left plain, and the complexity is built up through layers of charges. But you can see here that there's a fair range of different fields available in authentic Tudor heraldry. There's a couple of examples of Girony and Per-Ben Sinister, Party of 6. There's a few examples of Party of 6. So all the standard field divisions, which is unsurprising because SCA heraldry is based on English heraldry, Anglo-Norman heraldry. And so there's just fewer with the complex devices. I wouldn't say that necessarily to have a complex device you need to pick one of the ones that there's an example of. I just think that this graph shows that if you're going to build up a complex Tudor device, you're probably going to choose a plain field. And there's just few examples of any other field that isn't plain, basically. All right, so now I want to look at charge structure. And this table might be a little bit complicated to read. So it might be something that's better to review later or think about later. But basically what I'm trying to show here is that across all devices, some fairly simple structures are the most common. So an uncharged ordinary and a secondary group. Or a group uncharged primary alone on the field, or a charged primary and a secondary. And in these charts, primary and ordinary are used exclusively. So primary means a non-ordinary, and secondary means a non-peripheral group. But in the high complexity group, the most common is a charged ordinary with an uncharged secondary group and a charged peripheral, which is most often a chief, but sometimes a bordure, which we'll see in later tables in this slide deck. And the next most common is an uncharged ordinary and uncharged secondary and a charged peripheral, which is mostly a chief. So you can see although there are quite a few complex devices in Tudor heraldry, they follow a fairly consistent pattern. A large majority of them have very similar elements that they're built up from. And so they break certain rules, but they also follow their own style. Okay, so popular primary charges. And you'll see here that the list of popular charges is not very different between all devices and high complexity. Chevrons are very popular in English heraldry. I didn't actually understand how popular. I mean, I knew there were lots of chevrons, but until I actually crunched the numbers and went, it's the most popular charge. It's more popular than a cross. It's more popular than a lion. Chevrons are it. And then fesses, which I wasn't expecting. I was expecting them to be fairly popular. But they are, again, more popular than a cross and a line, fesses and bends as well. So you can see ordinaries feature, excuse me, feature heavily in English heraldry. And that's both the high complexity and the base code. And as I show in that bottom statistic. So across all devices, 60% had an ordinary as their primary charge. Sorry, 60% of all primary charges. So that doesn't include field primary devices, but field primary devices aren't particularly popular. They might be 5 or 10% of the total. And if they are field primary, most of them have a chief to clear conflict. And then in high complexity, 85% have an ordinary. So if you're following, standard complex Tudor style, you're going to have an ordinary as the base of what the structure that you're going to build up. So then I looked at secondary charges. Again, if you paid attention to all of those examples I showed you before, it shouldn't be surprising that a chief is the most common across all devices and even more so in high complexity devices. Bordures come next, and then I kind of grouped all the heads together to get a sense of the popularity of heads versus birds versus crosses and roundels. But I've got a list down there. So, and the list of identified birds, as that they're painted in a particular shape, or the blazon in DBA gives a particular bird as the bird that's used. There's quite a lot. There's very few birds that are just sort of generic birds. There's a lot of martlets, quite a few eagles, but all sorts of examples of birds with particular shapes. They tend all to be in default posture. They're almost all close. I didn't pull that stat out for this analysis, but it would be possible to pull it out of the spreadsheet pretty easily. And heads includes all sorts of heads. Lions, griffins, boars, spearheads I included just because it was easy to. More heads are the most common human head, but there's also a generic Caucasian head on a couple of devices as well. So heads are very popular as secondary charges. And you can see, and if you have a look at the armorial, you can see that they're choosing fairly round or square. They're not choosing long charges for secondary charges. They're choosing something that fits nicely around a cross or fits nicely around a chevron. So something that's fairly stocky in terms of shape rather than long and pointy. So the peripheral percentage is actually higher because to do this analysis, I just counted all the secondary charge groups. So where you have a device that has a chief and a secondary on the field, or a bordure and a secondary on the field, both of those would be counted separately for this analysis. So the number of devices with a peripheral is higher than the percentage of peripherals amongst all secondary charges. All right, now tertiary charges. Again, if you're paying attention to what we were looking at before, it shouldn't be too surprising that roundels are the most popular tertiary charge. They only come in just ahead of the collection of all birds in total. I collected foils and flowers together just to see how that would look as a total, because they're quite popular, but there's a range of different options there. So I included foils with flowers. Foils are about half, and various flowers are the other half. Roses are slightly more popular than the other flowers, but not that much more. And there's lots of flowers that are painted as a particular flower that they're not a generic foil or a rose shape. painted in profile to show columbines and things like that. You start to see escallops in tertiary charges. They tend not to be, there's a few in secondary, but they become more popular in tertiary charges, and you've still got lots of crosses and lines because it's English heraldry. So quaternary charges. Now this is something I'm not sure I've seen anywhere else in period except in Tudor heraldry. It's found only on 20 devices out of the over 1,000 that we're looking at, and they're obviously the highest complexity ones. Of those 20, 40% are on roundels on chiefs. So they're whatever charge you like, or not whatever charge you like, a charge that fits nicely on a roundel on a chief. And then another 25% are on roundels on ordinaries, and then another 20% are roundels on another charge. So they're roundels on a cross or a saltar on the ordinary or on the chief. So if you want to go to quaternary charges, you should be using a roundel, either as the tertiary and then a quaternary on top, or a different tertiary with a roundel on top, or more than one roundel on top. And even the remaining 50% still have a simple shape involved, either as the charge tertiary or as the quaternary charge. It's going to be a simple shape like a mullet or a lozenge or a roundel. So what that says to me is recognizability is still important. It doesn't have to be recognizable across the battlefield, but it's, you know, when you paint 12 shields on a page, you still need to be able to clearly see what that tertiary and quaternary charge are. And a way to do that is to make one of those two a very simple shape. All right, so any questions on that stuff?
Is that going to be enough for IAPs? 20 devices out of 1,000? Can we fight with that, or do we need to find more? Or
You only need 3, so 20 is heaps.
Fair enough. Ooh, the potential for evil! I love it.
Well, I mean, it's already been done. I'm just trying to make it easier to be more authentic about it, because obviously, the more authentic you are, the more favorably that IAP is going to be viewed. And the more examples you have, if you have more than 3, you know, if you have 20 examples, or, well, this won't be 20, but say you've got a quaternary charge on a roundel on a chief, you know, that's 8 devices before you get to round other quaternary charges examples, you know, so it's not that hard. So if we go back to, yeah, perhaps at this point, let's go back to, I'll just flick all the way back.
And while he's clicking, these 2 that have been done, the one on a badge form here was submitted in 2010. And the one on a device form was submitted last Penzic and only passed a couple of months ago. So there haven't been a ton of these, but it's absolutely plausible. The badge form here is a complexity of 12. And I think the other one is 13, but I got to check my notes. We might have made it 14 because I was overachieving. No, it's 13.
Yeah, I think I read 13 on Oscar when I just grabbed these earlier. But so you can see here, we've got a chevron in both, which is excellent. We've got mixed secondaries on the chevron in both, and it's that one in the middle and then 2 either side that are the same, which is a really common pattern. You've got 3 secondaries well placed around the chevron. None of this on top of the point of the chevron like SCA heraldry likes to do. It's always well distributed around, and they're stocky charges. They're heads, which we've seen is very common, and a rose there. I'm not sure how many tertiary groups I've got that are mixed like that, with 2 griffin heads and a rose like that. I'd probably suggest consistent charges there would be slightly more authentic. But even the fox, is that salient? Or
Courant. It was taken
Courant.
out of multiple examples in DBA that were registered under Wolseley.
Yeah, there's even a few in Insignia Anglica of dogs and things, courant and statin and passant on a chief like that.
Yeah.
And that's the way they would do it. They would just have one because it fits really nicely. And the more you look at this, the more that you realize that it's about things fitting together nicely, even though it's super complex compared to earlier heraldry. It's still about things fitting nicely. So 3 roundels fits nicely on a chief. It's a great number to have. And 3 fleur-de-lis on the roundels. You can clearly see the fleur-de-lis because the roundel is a simple shape. And again, with the roundels on the left-hand side, you can clearly see the griffin heads because they've got really good contrast, and it's a roundel, so it's a simple shape. So these, I've only seen these in the last hour, but just looking at them straight away, they're really good examples. So I'm not surprised that the college passed them.
One of the other things that Juliana found when she was doing her research that was supported by mine as well is that the tinctures that were used on the chief are often not echoed in the main device. And so you'll see here that we use the gules only in the charges on the chief, and they're not in the main body of the device. And that the colors that are in the main body of the device are not the ones that you're seeing on the chief, and that there's sort of a division visually that way between what's above and what's below.
Huh. I hadn't noticed that, but that's something I can easily, well, not super easily, but something I can break up the data to have a look at to see if that's the case. But it certainly seems plausible. It's not something.
Well, if we just take a look through the next few slides, I wasn't looking for it particularly when we were scrolling through them originally, but
yeah.
You know, in that first one here, the red and the black are both unique to the chief.
And well, the Moor is almost unique too. Like there's the Moors are vested ore, but really.
Yeah. It's harder to do with the metals because you've only got 2 of them.
Yeah.
But the colors, mostly you don't see duplication between the main body and what's up above.
Yeah. There's a slight counterexample there on the right, but for the most part, that's quite interesting. There's a really good example where they have done it with the metals.
There's a good question in the chat.
That kind of suggests that they sort of saw the chief as separate, like, you know, almost like the crest and the mantling and so on. The chief was like a necessary but separate part. Did there tend to be examples in the same family, say, looking at that one, of just the Paley gules and vert with the chevron without the chief, as if they sort of, you know, used that as a separate device or badge, and then they stuck the chief on for formal occasions? Did that sort of show up? I guess if you hadn't sort of averted to this, you might not have noticed.
Most of these are fairly new nobles because they're the ones that have come to Risley and others, but he gets blamed for most of this stuff, and probably quite rightly. I mean, very rightly. He did change his name to make it have more letters in it, a lot more letters. So I don't think there would be any examples. You'd have to sort of look past period to see if that was the case, but I don't think so. I think these are, if I may, created. I mean, it's possible. If I may, while I can't speak to English heraldry, it certainly was something that was done in Italian heraldry. They used something called a chief of allegiance. And so in the Italian armorials, you will see a base coat of arms that is displayed. You see it mostly with the Tale of Two Popes, where some families were displaying with the Eagle of the Holy Roman Empire, and others were displaying with a coat of arms of France or France difference as a chief. But they'd adopted them for so long that they had incorporated them into their coats of arms. But you can see 2 different branches of the same family with 2 different chiefs of allegiance with those different pieces. So
it's not unheard of in heraldry in general. I don't know how much, if at all, the English did it.
Yeah, I would suggest that sort of concept is definitely not what's happening here. I mean, they may consider the chief separate, but it's definitely not any sort of symbolism past the personal, because the chiefs are so different. Each chief, like sometimes the chiefs will repeat charges that are in the main body of the device, but there's quite a range of charges on the chiefs. I mean, there's trends like roundels, but you can see why roundels are there. There's trends like heads of animals and lions and things, but again, that's almost certainly because they're just super popular in heraldry. You know, these people hunted animals all the times and loved animals, and thought lions were really cool. So, I would suggest that it was, based on what I've seen, it's very much more the needing to be complex enough to clear conflict. I mean, it's almost like SCA heraldry, because at this point there's so many armigers that that you need to clear conflict. You want to be different. It's all on paper. It doesn't have to be painted on a bunch of shields anymore. So it's just going to look pretty hanging on your wall.
There was also a, to my understanding at least, there was a certain amount of wanting to differentiate sort of the new upstart, new blood nobility from the old families. And so Rowsley, however the heck you pronounce that, oh my God, long name that isn't, very intentionally gave these new upstart, new money people who were not the old blood family more complicated arms. The people who were coming up through the merchant classes, who were being given arms because they had money, not because they had blood. And so the extra complexity is more to differentiate the new non-armory from the old actual nobility families. So it wasn't so much these had to be complex to clear conflict. As we've found with opening up Senna, there's a lot of really simple armory space that could have been used. I think this really was a deliberate design choice on the part of Garter.
Excuse me? Excuse me?
Yes, Basil.
There's a question in chat. Do you have any examples of charged borders?
Yes. And I can probably find you one if you bear with me for a minute. And we've got a few minutes left. So, and I've just got a conclusion to go, which will only take me 5 minutes. So if you bear with me for 2 seconds.
While you're digging for that example, I have a question for you about your methodology. Sure. As you were going through this, did you do any date cross comparison with DBA to find out when the more complex versus less complex arms were created?
No. Okay. One, because a lot of them are hard to find in DBA, if at all. When I went to DBA once, I started to have difficulty blazoning because the art was poor or my knowledge of particular weird charges was not sufficient. And I didn't find most of the ones I was looking for. So I suspect that the ones that you're most interested in finding, because they're the weirdest or the new, you want to know that they were done quite recently, they're the ones that aren't going to be in DBA. And the ones that are in DBA tend to be the older ones that you kind of know are going to be older anyway. There's a lot of people with quarters of Mortimer and, Tudor and all sorts of things like that. And you just know that they're the older families and their main quarter is going to be pretty old as well.
Sure.
So you can get a guide from how early in the armorial it is, like how high ranked the family was. So that it's basically in order of rank. There's a certain amount of alphabeticalness near the end. And you can kind of assume that most of those are pretty new. And the ones earlier are less new. And probably I mean, it would be really interesting to do a date analysis if you were certain of getting enough dates, but I wouldn't be certain enough to bother. But it'd be something to do. It'd be interesting. All right, charge bordures. Do I have any with quaternaries?
Or even just tertiaries.
Oh, I've got heaps with tertiaries. Yeah. Let's see if I can find a good bunch of pages. Sorry. Now, what am I sharing with you guys? Here we go.
Your slides at the moment.
Okay. All right. Okay. So here, oh, I'll zoom out a little bit. Hopefully that's not too small. You've got a Borgia Sable Byzanti, second from the left. Another Borgia Byzanti, a Borgia Foily. There's a lot of company and counter company, which I didn't sort of mention in my slides, but that's also something that's much more common in Tudor heraldry than in SCA heraldry. There's a lot of that. Fess's counter company, Borgia's company, that sort of stuff. Another Byzanti, Borgia. Oh, that's ermine. That's not charged. There should be a couple more. Oh, here we go. Here's one with mixed tertiaries on a Borgia. And oh, this one's a good one. I should have pulled this one out. But you've got a Griffin, half Azure Freddy Argent and half Sable. And then crosses Formy and trefoils on the Borgia. There should be one more. Oh yeah, here's a crosses Formy Ficci on a Borgia. They tend to be fairly simple charges because they've got to fit. It's like all the other things we've been looking at. They've got to fit and make sense.
What the heck? Oh, that's two arms and a horseshoe. Okay.
Oh yeah, so I pulled that one out. Oh, maybe that's.
I was trying to parse it as a single charge, and it was not parsing.
No, yeah, I've actually pulled that one out on the next slide that we haven't got to yet. There should be one more. Oh, more Byzanti.
Each holding a horseshoe, like they're gonna break it like a wish.
Yeah, I'll go back to the slides now. Hold on, if I can. Share screen.
In a heraldry treatise of about this period, I found a rather interesting Borgia that actually had the quartered arms of England and France smooshed out to the edges, which seems a really cool way to do an augmentation if you don't mind completely messing up the arms.
Sorry, what was that? I was worried about my slides.
An example from a treatise from about this period was a Borgia with the quartered arms of England and France smooshed out to the sides.
Yes. Yeah, smooshed out as a Borgia. I think that might be in this one. I'd have to go looking for it. But yeah, that's fairly early on, so that's pretty clearly an augmentation that's been granted by the king to some high-ranking person. I forget who, but it's in there somewhere. I could find it with a bit of digging. So here we are. It's on one of the last slides. So let's go through the more first. So if you want to follow high complexity Tudor heraldic style, things you should do more of are use the 5 primary tinctures for the most part. So your complexity is mostly going to come from charges. If you're getting up to past 10, I mean, I had a look at the ratio, and the ratio is fairly even between tinctures and charges in high complexity. So there's some that only use 3 tinctures and use 5 or 6 or 7 charges. and there's more that use 4 or 5 tinctures and 3, 4, 5, 6 different charges. Use plain fields. Build up complexity with an ordinary, secondaries around that ordinary, a peripheral, usually a chief, and then you can charge one or more of those. Secondaries and tertiaries can be mixed or consistent. And as I said, those patterns tend to be one in the middle and the same on the outside, or all mixed. And if you're going to have quaternaries, they're almost certainly going to be on roundels on chiefs. Is that most common pattern and the easiest to get an IAP for. So do less if you're aiming for high complexity, authentic Tudor heraldry, less divided fields, fewer complex lines on ordinaries. There's a fair few complex lines on ordinaries, but they tend not to appear in the most complex devices. They tend to be the devices that are a bit less complex, a bit like this example here, which I pulled up because it's one of the few examples of maintained in the armorial. But you can see here, this has got a journey, it's got an engrailed bend, but it's still only, what is it, 8? 9, complexity 9. So it's fairly highly complex, but if you're going to push it much further than that, it's not going to be, you're not going to also have complex lines as well as many different charge types. The use of vert outside of flowers or popinjays is very rare. You're not going to see small charges with indistinct shapes. So in this maintained example, the swans are maintaining a cross-forming fichy, but that's a pretty distinct shape. Even, it's not painted particularly well, but you can see that's what it's supposed to be because it's a very sort of standard, common heraldic shape. And there's no maintained charges. There's only 2 in the entire collection. So you've got, and I've just put them there to show, the secondary swans maintaining these crosses fichy, and these tertiary cloud arms. That's not the correct term. I've just put that in to make the slides make more sense. Sustaining a horseshoe between them. So.
Are we sure that's a horseshoe?
It's got little markings. I don't know if you can see on your screens, but
No, it looks like a fish.
That's why I'm wondering, because it looks like it. Yeah, it looks like it has a tail.
That's where on the manuscript.
Oh, okay.
Once you.
Yeah, it looks like chipped paint from here.
Yeah, once you've stared at this manuscript enough, you know what's chipped paint and what's actually supposed to be argent.
Got it.
Even though they don't paint it, so that's why when the paint chips, it's the same color. You can just tell the difference. So that's a horseshoe.
That's a sustained charge rather than maintained one. Because that's a bunch of 3 specific objects of each of equal artistic weight.
Yes. So strictly speaking, by
SCA, the cross is almost indistinguishable.
Yes.
Perhaps that should say held charges, but the statement stands. There's 2 examples.
Yeah. Either way, don't do it. That's the point.
Will your slides and data be made available at some point? I couldn't find them in the proceedings.
That's because I've been working on them right up until now. Like the last change was made as we talked.
Right, because we had that conversation.
Yeah. So they weren't ready. I will share the slides. I understand that I can just email them to Amelia and get them in the proceedings. The data I'm happy to share for specific people for specific reasons. So if I would like to know, I suppose I put a lot of work into it. I'd like to know what people are going to use it for. But I would be, absolutely, Beatrice, you have a clear interest in this stuff and are registering this stuff. And anyone who wants it to use to justify an IAP or research justifying IAPs, they're welcome to it. I'm just not making it like freely available on the internet.
I would be very interested at some point when my current Oh My God Laurel project is done to actually try and do that DBA data analysis.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm available at Domhnall@fastmail.com.au. I'm pretty easy to find on Heraldry on Facebook and things as well. People can, you know, if you say Domhnall the Herald in Lochac, everyone knows who I am. So
I'm on the Oscar roster. I'm fairly easy to find. I'm under North Shield, and my email's in the chat.
Cool. Any other questions before Thorfinn wraps me up?
Yep.
Thank you. This was lovely.
Yes, it's been great. Thank you for the discussion.
Exit full screen. Say.
Oh, there's some questions in the chat I missed. Sorry.
I think we mostly said them to you.
There are some cadency marks. There's not a huge number. There are some labels and some crescents and things. There wasn't a massive amount. So I wasn't too stressed about it one way or the other. But I think there's a few. I could pull them up. Actually, Pitari's left. So I might have to answer that in the Discord or something. Catch up with him later. Goose Game, yes, it does look very much like Goose Game, 1550 edition. Absolutely.
Yeah, that was right on.
Right. Well, it looks like we're accumulating some people for my session. So,
all right, thank you all.
Yeah, at 58 minutes, about time to say thank you, Don.